Europe's been working for 50 years to create a United States of Europe through the European Union. Do you think that's, is that now so questioned because of the turmoil that they're living through, that that's not a reality?
I think a united Europe came into being out of fear. I think that's quite obvious. Not only the war, but the post-war incertitudes and occasional threats. I think that entity is now on the way to a disintegration because the fear is gone. Not necessarily on the part of everybody, but of enough powers in a united Europe for the result to be a disunited Europe. And this particularly pertains to countries like, let's say, Italy, but now increasingly Great Britain, and especially because of its legacy-type inclination to stand aside. Now, this is not to say that I welcome this, but there is a certain inevitability to that. Now, if Putin starts another wave of Cold War unilateral actions, they'll probably all come back again in some fashion. Otherwise, it's probably, at least in part, inevitable. Maybe it moved too much, maybe it became too formal. In my own case, in my own personal opinion, it became too broad. I don't want to make public enemies, but I would say there are at least 10 countries in the European Union that we should have never admitted it in the first place. They were neither ready for Europe or had the qualifications necessary to be in Europe. And I don't think that was helpful.
When Russia invaded Crimea, it really introduced a fundamental question about where Europe was going. Is it by force of arms and raw national interests, or is there some larger culture of multilateral collaboration that shapes the future of Europe? Was this a really transforming event when they invaded Crimea?
Well, it was transforming in the sense that for the first time since World War II, force was used within Europe by a major power. But beyond that, it really differs much more from regions to regions. Obviously, those closest to Russia were the most affected. The Germans, realizing that they opened the doors to a prolonged war that destroyed Europe, were responsive. The French went along because they also needed our support in the former French areas. The British did so out of loyalty to the Anglo-American alliance. But there were a number of countries which were quite prepared to deal under the table with the Russians. So the solution wasn't all that perfect. On the other hand, the Russians themselves realized that they go too far, they could get bogged down in a prolonged war in which we would become more engaged. Then most of the European countries, willy-nilly, would have to be engaged. And it could prove to be much more costly than they have calculated. And now I think there is a kind of pattern of quasi-accommodation and a waiting game to see what happens, in which for the first time the Ukrainians are beginning to outdo the Russians in terms of really attempting some serious reforms or creating a sense of unity built around national symbols like this woman flyer and so forth. Something for them to admire, to love, to be proud of, to be resentful on how they were treated. On the Russian side, I think there's growing uncertainty, growing speculation, really, what is involved here. Crimea by itself doesn't give them much. Any international trade with Crimea is subject to international suits, so it's not an economic benefit. I think at some point, some leadership in Russia, maybe after Putin, will have to say, let's find some accommodation. Maybe even there's some way of contriving an arrangement whereby Crimea becomes a kind of dual status entity, which, to the advantage both of Russia and of Ukraine, it serves as a tourist attraction and so forth, but it's not intimately integrated into either country. That might be, but you know, it's going to be complicated, and obviously there's no simple solution here. But a one-sided solution right now seems less probable than it did when this whole affair started several years ago. The Russians are at a loss. For more than half a century, they were historically guided by a doctrine which gave them some sense whither things are headed. Now they're beginning to discover that that doctrine is no longer relevant. And the question is, what should substitute for it? And I don't think they have found it except in one simple dimension: leadership. Follow the leader, obey the leader, trust the leader, applaud the leader, and so forth. But I doubt that this will endure for long after Putin is gone.
The Chinese appear to have a genuine strategy. Do you think the Russians have a strategy?
Well, I don't want to sound trivial, and perhaps I already am, but I think the strategy that is driving right now Putin and his associates is a peculiar combination of kind of false pride and misunderstanding of Russian history, and thinking that somehow perhaps that can be revived, restored. And on the other hand, something quite unprecedented in our time: the quest for money. This is something unusual. You know, in the worst days of fascism and Nazism, Hitler and Mussolini were not out there, so to speak, putting away big cash amount in some private banks or possessions. Hitler had his eagle's nest, but it belonged to the people. It really wasn't his, in a sense, though he could use it anytime he wanted. Mussolini loved uniforms and glamour and so forth. This guy goes further. There have been studies on this subject.
This guy, Putin.
Putin, yes, which indicate that his personal wealth is apparently, and the information allegedly is authentic and based on sources which are probably intelligence services of the main concerned powers. It's somewhere in the circle of $20 billion per one person, who now has mansions all over the place, in Sochi, in many other places in Russia, perhaps, rather probably so, building something personal in Spain, magnificent send-offs for his daughters. That gets around. The Russians begin to learn that. But more important than that, there's probably about 100 people or so who help him. These are not the typical secret police guys who put people in jail and shoot them and torture them. No, these are kind of fellow conmen, businessmen, quote unquote. And they're perfectly happy to be stashing away $2.5 billion per family. That's the inner core. And then outside, in London, there's a large community of Russians, Russian businessmen, who emigrated, who are now living in the Las Vegas of the world, which is the London city, making money, probably have $2 billion per family or something like that. They help Putin and his associates, but they play the game safely from abroad. Well, that's a very different orientation from traditional dictatorship. So the ideological element in it gets buried. There are remnants of it. But right now it's really a more conventional struggle for power, preeminence, and self-comfort. Now, what will happen after that begins to break down, especially if the economy falters, I cannot predict. But I imagine there'll be upheavals and some sort of sense of desire from the public pouring upwards to gain greater influence over a domestic arrangement, which to survive increasingly will have to, in some respects, be similar to what exists in Western Europe. That is kind of law-abiding society, choice of top leaders, etc. So in that sense, I am optimistic. In China, I fear it could be more difficult. The Chinese have done very well, remarkably well, under some exceptional leaders. of course, the top leader himself, and then more lately the others, a couple of the others. But one doesn't see them being successfully replaced as things move forward. In one sense, there's a growing alienation of the ruling elite from the masses. And I don't know how the masses will react, but I think there's a real danger that there could be serious upheavals in China.